name is Rishi, this is Saavan, and today we will be discussing Beowulf. Now, more specifically, we will be discussing an article by S. Greenfield that discusses or re-marvelizes Beowulf. Essentially, he's countering another article written by Fred C. Robinson that is trying to explain the feats performed by Beowulf were exaggerated, and he is, in fact, human rather than superhuman. He does this by touching on three major scenes throughout the book where he shows feats that an average human could not accomplish. To begin, Greenfield introduces the main idea of the literary article up front. He states that the author, Fred C. Robinson, in a different article, attempts to state that the feats by Beowulf were performed throughout the poem that were in fact human and not as impressive as they seem. Greenfield, on the other hand, attempts to refute that idea by proving why Robinson's claims are faulty. But one thing that Greenfield does lack in the podcast is he does not supplement additional evidence for where Beowulf is in fact a superhuman, and that is a little bit of what we'll be doing today, in addition to commenting on this article as a whole. So, Saavan, let's start.
Okay, so to start off with the points that were hit by Robinson in his essay, right? The first point was that Beowulf's descent into the mere. So essentially, after the fight with Grendel's mom attacked Hero the next day, and Beowulf and a party followed Grendel's mom to a mere, and once Grendel's mom entered the mere, Beowulf entered the mere himself. And the main superhuman trait that was shown in this is that Beowulf was in this mere for hours on end. To start off, Robinson refutes that this feat was not actually superhuman by stating that, as for the descent into the mere, while it was said that it took the good part of a day, which would seem superhuman, the lighting by the sun states that they were still in broad daylight, meaning that the descent, fight, and reascent did not take very long. Robinson argues that the course of the venture to attack Grendel's mother starts at the break of dawn when they set out for the mere. Beowulf then sees the remains of the advisor Grendel's mother killed by broad daylight, hinting that at times between noon and the descent, fight and reascent occur over the course of an hour rather than over the course of multiple days.
Let's pause there. The very fact that even if Grendel's descent and fight and reascent occurred over the period of an hour or a couple hours, the fact that he was able to go down in a full suit of armor and hold his breath for, if we had to guess, at least 15 to 20 minutes while he was descending into the mere. And then on top of that, in his reascent, after a long fight, or at least an arduous fight with Grendel's mother, he must have been already out of breath and winded, but he was still able to come up, even though it was it took a very long time. As a result, I think that, in fact, Beowulf is superhuman because he was able to hold his breath for a very long time, even in these strenuous situations, and it took a long time to get down. So, in fact, he is superhuman.
That's true. We must also consider the fact that Robinson is arguing to convert the multiple days that it took down to 1 hour. But 1 hour is still a very superhuman feat that it hasn't been achieved by humans, and an impossible feat becoming a less impossible feat doesn't mean that Beowulf isn't. It's still not possible, right? So there's also that. And then now onto what Greenfield did to refute this argument. Rishi, what did Greenfield say?
What Greenfield said is that Robinson, first of all, invented the idea that this journey started in the growing light. Not once in the text does it say they started their journey at the beginning of the day or the break of dawn. In fact, what really happened is just the poem just said they started. So, for example, this itself is a flawed line of reasoning because it's basically saying that we don't have an accurate date of when he started. So, if he did happen to descend at the start of the day and come up during broad daylight, it's still over a long period of time, which is still superhuman. In addition, another argument he makes is based on the number of lines and how the number of lines of the poem affect the time frame. Would you care to explain more about that, Saavan?
So essentially, Greenfield argues that the amount of lines of poetry used to descend into the mirror and this entire fight scene and then coming back, it says that it was nearly like 400, 500 lines of poetry just for that event. Now he uses this to argue that what occurred actually took a long period of time. Now let's pause there to analyze what Greenfield utilized for this point, because I actually disagree with this. Like using lines of poetry to also represent chronology is not completely sound, because Rishi, there's a point later on in the poem itself where a line or two of poetry represented the 50 years of Beowulf's ruling over the Geats after he becomes king. So time and lines of poetry don't like match up in the same, like they're not supposed to match up. Sometimes it hyper focuses, sometimes it zooms out. This line of argument I actually disagree with.
And I agree with that, because it said that the reason that Robinson thought it was such a short period of time is because it only covered lines 1618 to 1624 of poetry. Only 6 lines of poetry. But as you said, that doesn't really mean anything in the time frame. So his reascent could have occurred for a longer amount of time, and we wouldn't know, especially in a time period where certain parts, such as the battles, happen over only a couple, maybe even 100 lines of poetry, while other stuff, such as the ancestry, occur over a really long period of time. Therefore, the lines of poetry do not make sense in determining chronology. So, what are your thoughts on the other superhuman feat that he performed as well while fighting the monk?
So, while Beowulf fights Grendel's mother, essentially what happened is that he had to pick up this heavy sword made by giants that the poem itself said that no other man could hold. The description of the sword directly from the poem is that it was so huge and heavy of itself that only Beowulf could have wielded it in battle. Now, hearing this directly follows the kinds of what you'd expect in the plot of a work that tries to demonstrate a motif of heroism. There has to be a heroic character that achieves things like this, and essentially the value would be diminished if Beowulf doesn't have the superhuman traits, as he's already fighting monsters, right?
I agree. That magical aspect of it, just as a whole and in general, completely opens the door to the idea that Beowulf could in fact be superhuman. Because he's fighting monsters that are descendants of Cain. He's picking up swords of giants, and later on in the book, he even fights a dragon. But this is not the only point in which this occurs. There's a second feat that Robinson tries to refute, and this is a swimming match between him and Brecca, a fellow Geat. The problem with this argument is Robinson argues that there's 2 versions of the story, and both of them are biased. One is from Unferth, who is made to be an untrustworthy, doubting character whose goal was to make Beowulf's account look much weaker. While Beowulf, on the other hand, is the other side of the story, who is already known to be boastful and brags about his opportunities, and according to Robinson, Beowulf's account is given in terms less imposing and more non-committal. He proceeds to argue that this non-committal nature suggests that part of the time spent in the swimming match could have in fact been in a boat, rather than a genuine swimming match. So Saavan, what are your thoughts on that?
So, the fact that Robinson continues to remark that whereas Unferth makes it appear that the 2 contestants set out swimming, Beowulf uses the verbs like rowen, which means to go by water, row, or sail, and fluotan, which means to float, drift, flow, or sail. The fact that they're comparing words again hits back to our point from before, where discrepancies on the translation from Old English to New English does not necessarily mean that like the author himself, you can't base that as your judgment for whether the author is trying to show superhuman traits or not. We need to focus on the actual plot that occurred, right? And so notice how that this entire thing itself is a swimming match, right? Where this is what Greenfield goes on to hit on, but essentially, if they're doing a match for swimming, why would they? Where they're testing like it's a match, it's a battle where they're trying to see who's stronger. Now, if they're in a boat to do that, how is that tested, right? They have to be swimming. And Rishi, what does Greenfield go on to say about this?
Greenfield goes on to say that that when Beowulf was talking in the story, he said that they were testing who had the greater sea strength and hardship in the waves than the other man. How can you have hardship in the waves if you're in a boat? That physically does not make any sense. As a result, Greenfield thought it meant that that this hardship was physically swimming. In addition to that, when Beowulf is giving his recount of the story, he says that in the middle of the swimming match, he was taken by what says here fishies, but were also sea monsters, and he was dragged to the bottom of the sea. What doesn't make sense is how could these fish have dragged him to the bottom of the sea if he was in a boat? As a result, this is another place where he was in the swimming match, so he was swimming for days on end, and so this is in fact a superhuman feat. So Saavan, what do you think about the third example of the fighting against the Frisians, where Beowulf is the sole survivor?
Mm-hmm. So let's pause right there itself, right? Before we get to the actual event, notice that Beowulf himself is the sole survivor of an entire battle against the Frisians. Like event after event, we keep seeing that Beowulf happens to be the strongest man in Geatland, the biggest hero, the most respected, and right now we see he's the only survivor that ended up in this very clearly bloody battle against the Frisians to end up like swimming across the sea back to Geatland. Like to start off with Robinson's argument on this. Like what Robinson argues about the actual travel is that the method of locomotion over the sea may not have necessarily actually been swimming. He uses the words overswam, not he, sorry. The poem itself uses the word overswam, which was used in the text that can actually mean anything from pass over, cross, or sail. Robinson then argues that the armor that Beowulf carried back across the river was not necessarily full suits of armor in miscellaneous pieces. Rishi, what do you think about the word itself and this armor?
So again, like we've been saying throughout this entire podcast, the biggest thing is discrepancies in translations. The word hildgitwa, which is used in the Old English text, Robinson argues could mean not 30 full pieces of armor, but in fact 30 unspecified pieces of war gear, whether that be helmets or swords. But this goes to contradict Robinson's point, because what Greenfield argues is in fact that doesn't make any sense at all. The very fact that you're carrying 30 pieces of armor, which at the time were all made out of metal and decorated with many ornaments, which make it even heavier, means that these were all very heavy pieces to wear and carry. So carrying 30 pieces of and even unspecified war gear is seemingly superhuman and doesn't make sense. What are your thoughts on that, in addition to other characters who have showed similar strength like this?
So first of all, what you said about like the 30 pieces doesn't matter. This also goes back to what we said in the first point, where whether he was in the mirror for an hour or multiple days, a feat that is impossible and a feat that's less impossible, it doesn't matter if you can dumb it down to be less impossible. The feat itself, he still achieved a superhuman feat. And in the same way with the suits of armor, like Robinson trying to prove that it wasn't full suits of armor, but rather just helmets, that still does not really help his argument here, because it's still a superhuman feat, and it was still achieved by Beowulf, who just came from a very bloody battle, right? So now moving on to like other heroes from the time, or not just from the time, but from other epic poems. There's Gilgamesh, who also happens to be 2/3 divine, and there's Sigmund, who can drink poison without being killed. All these stories where epic heroes go through hardships or have like an entire plot line, the motif behind the story itself is heroism. And as you can clearly see, the hero itself has has superhuman traits, so that this motif can be properly shown. So, Rishi, what do you think about like the part where the author goes into Beowulf's hand strength? Because that's a point where you cannot exaggerate this fact. It's
Yes.
a numerical value.
So another point that's not even necessarily related to the aquatic battles is his hand strength. Multiple times throughout the poem, at the start and at the end, when he fights the dragon, which is another point that we'll touch on, it says that he has the hand strength of 30 men, which allowed him to rip off Grendel's arm when he was in a fight at Heroat Hall. As a result, in addition to that, the magic within the story, with the dragon, the Grendel, and all of these fights of heroism, opened the door to the fact that Beowulf could in fact be superhuman, and he is greater than life. And so, as a result, I think that Beowulf, because of this, is superhuman. And just to bring in another point, separate of the aquatic feats that were put in Greenfield and Robinson's text, is the fact that he fights a dragon. First of all, a supernatural creature like a dragon has a reputation of being the strong, aggressive, almost impossible to defeat opponent. So, Saavan, what do you think on the fact of incorporating his age now that he's an old king fighting this dragon? What are your thoughts on his still everlasting strength?
Right, so Beowulf, right? We know that this event occurs after a long period of time compared to the other events. Beowulf became king, and we know from the text that Beowulf was king for at least 50 years before this event occurred. And yet, while assembling his army for the men that he will take to attack the dragon, he took the 10 best warriors in Geatland and took them with him to the dragon. But of those 10, 9 of them fled when the dragon came out, and the strongest among them, Wiglaf, is the only one that stayed. Now, Wiglaf is actually a foil that represents Beowulf when Beowulf was a young warrior to his old king before, right? So even though Wiglaf is now currently the strongest young warrior in Geatland, we can notice that in the battle itself with the dragon, the majority of the fighting, the majority of attention goes to Beowulf's fighting, and Wiglaf, who's supposed to be the strongest young warrior, only played a part in distracting the dragon for mere moments so that Beowulf could achieve the final blow. So what does this show that Beowulf, at his old age, is still the most powerful man in Geatland? Like, clearly there's like, Rishi, what do you think? Like, this shows like the aspect where there has to be some kind of superhuman aspects to him.
I agree, and even on top of that, when he's fighting the dragon and he gets dealt the deadly blow that ends up killing him, he gets bit in the neck. But what doesn't make sense is most people would die from a bite in the neck regardless of what happens afterward. Yet he still had the strength, stronger than everybody else in Geatland, as you said, to kill the dragon, although he was bit in the neck. The only reason he died was because of the poison that the dragon had, not actually because he got bit, which again goes to show how superhuman he actually is. So, what Greenfield states overall is that while Robinson does make a case that there could be an interpretation of Beowulf as someone who is not as superhuman, it is not really proven very well and can be easily disproven to show he was a superhero, and that in fact he was a superhuman with epic qualities within all of his fights, and it's relatable to other epics. And as a result, we also agree with Greenfield's point that Beowulf is superhuman. And although there are discrepancies in translation and certain areas of the poem where the author isn't very clear on the description of Beowulf's strength, the magical presence within the story and the idea of unrealistic supernatural powers that Beowulf has, as well as the underlying theme of heroism that is seen within many superhumans throughout the entire poem, makes it seem that Beowulf, as we think, is in fact greater than life and is in fact superhuman and remarkabilized. Thank you.